Anyone with even a tiny bit of historical knowledge will be able to tell you who Napoleon Bonaparte was. The French first consul and emperor who led the country throughout the Napoleonic Wars and is responsible for nearly dominating the continent in its entirety. He is a well-remembered figure, with him being one of the internationally best-known men of history, with many still considering him the greatest general to ever live. While not as famous, many still know his nephew, Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, better known as Napoleon III. He too is an emperor, who reigned over France for nearly 20 years. While not as successful, he still left a mark on history in his own way. But wait a minute, many of you may be asking, so first we had Napoleon I, and then we went straight to Napoleon III? What happened to Napoleon II? Well, as a matter of fact, there was another Napoleon between the two better-known ones. Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles Bonaparte was this very Napoleon II, and he was the son of the very Napoleon Bonaparte, as well as Marie Louise of Austria. Napoleon Bonaparte had originally been married to Josephine, an impoverished aristocrat. However, their relationship deteriorated over their 14-year-long marriage, both over the affairs both had, as well as the fact that Josephine was unable to bear Napoleon any children. This became a problem for Napoleon, as if he wanted to secure the future of his empire, he would need an heir to prevent a succession crisis from happening upon his death. Thus, a deal was agreed upon the times the terms of the Treaty of Schönbrunn were being agreed upon in late 1809. The treaty made peace between France and Austria and brought to an end the War of the Fifth Coalition. Though not part of the treaty itself, it was also agreed between France and Austria that Napoleon would marry the daughter of the Austrian Emperor Francis I, Maria Louisa, which would also involve Napoleon divorcing Josephine. This was a win for Napoleon, as he would now get a new chance at an heir. While the marriage also made it likely France and Austria would remain on good terms, despite the harsh terms the treaty imposed on the country. As Maria Louisa moved into the French court, her name would be changed to Marie Louise, so it would sound more French. It would not take long for Marie Louise to conceive and eventually give birth to her first child on the 20th of March 1811, and thus Napoleon II had been born. While reports showed that Marie Louise did not care much for her son, the same could not be said of Napoleon himself. He loved his son and spending time with him, although said time would be limited by the many responsibilities the emperor had. This may sound sweet, but the story does not get a happy ending. At the point that Napoleon II would last see his dad, he was not even 3 years old. You probably know where this ends, with Napoleon being defeated and forcibly abdicating. He would come back a year later, but he would be defeated, abdicate, and be exiled once again. Napoleon would be sent to St. Helena this time, where he would die 6 years later in 1821. And this is where things get interesting, because both times his father was exiled, for a brief time, Napoleon II served as emperor twice. First for 2 days from April the 4th to the 6th in 1814, and then again for about 2 weeks from the 22nd of June to the 7th of July, 1815. Of course, the young Napoleon would not actually be in charge of the country. A commission would be formed, presided over by Joseph Fouché, who had held multiple governmental positions under Napoleon, to govern the country. However, the approaching British armies meant that the commission would only be able to govern the country for 2 weeks until it was defeated, and the Bourbon dynasty under Louis XVIII was restored. Yet, this reign was significant enough for the Bonaparte dynasty to consider the young Napoleon II to have been a real and legitimate emperor of the French. And this is the tragedy of Napoleon II, a boy who had been born with everything, yet had lost it all in just a few short years, from no fault of his own. He had been born to a loving dad, who also happened to be the master of the European continent. Yet by his 3rd birthday, he had already lost his dad, and within a year, any imperial hopes he may have had in the future were crushed. His country would be lost to him too, as the rest of the Bonaparte family would be forcibly exiled. This did not mean everything was bad for the young Napoleon, however. He would resettle in Austria, where he would be taken in as an almost adopted member of the Austrian royal family. Through his mother, he had technically briefly served as the Prince of Parma, and other titles would be conferred to him by the Austrians. Emperor Francis I of Austria, who was Napoleon II's grandfather, attempted to mold the young boy away from his French origins and towards Austrian nobility. Francis first established the Duchy of Reichstadt in what is now the Czech Republic and gave the title of Duke to the young Napoleon in 1818 when he was still just 7 years old. He would be given access to the great Imperial Library of Vienna, which is where he would relearn French and rediscover his father. However, the thing Napoleon II was most famous for after his brief reign was his brief military career. At age 11, Francis would name him a corporal, and he would make the choice to become an officer at age 15 and receive training for it. He would 2 years later be appointed as the captain of a Tyrolean regiment by his grandfather, and later the leader of a battalion. Things were looking up for the young Napoleon, but things were just not to be. In early 1832, the young officer would catch several cases of pneumonia, such as tuberculosis, which left him confined to his bed. It would be as early as April 1832, just a month after his 21st birthday, that the doctors tending to him considered him lost. His condition was simply not treatable. His mother would receive a warning, and she would join her son on June the 24th for his final weeks. He would die less than a month later on the 22nd of July from his condition. It is a tragic tale, and it isn't the only one from within the Bonaparte family. Napoleon IV, the son of Napoleon III, would face a similar fate. He too would lose everything, and then die at only age 23, in action as a soldier in the Anglo-Zulu War. I do think in all that what happened to these two young men is a tragedy, and one that is worth telling. It often becomes easy to subconsciously forget when we deal with historical figures so long removed for us that these were human beings too. They were people just as much as you and me. This might seem obvious, but it is easy to forget when we deal with figures such as these two Bonapartes. These two men dealt with lives that were treacherous in ways we could never imagine today. Their short lives and early deaths were tragic and greatly affected the people whom they loved and cared for. Historical figures are like any person we may meet today, men and women with goals, ambitions, and flaws. Just like people you meet today, many were great and many were terrible, as is part of a human condition. Their humanity is something we must never forget, for without it we lose the biggest thing underpinning all of human history.